Okay, the final, term I want you to have a sense of, and the final kind of language issue that I want you to consider is something called an anomia, which means a deficit in being able to name things. So a, of course, means none, right? A means nothing. Nome is name. So an anomia means you cannot name something. And we all have this to a certain extent. Again, when you're tired, when you're stressed, when you're, not really, engaged, you have that, we call it sometimes the tip of the tongue phenomenon. You're like, oh, I want it's the this, the that. You just cannot get that name. Well, sometimes people have damage to the brain that makes it a much more persistent and extensive issue and concern, where they have a more generalized anomia, difficulty with naming objects. And it turns out that there are some naming difficulties that are associated with Broca's aphasia. The severity of the deficit in Broca, remember, depended upon the grammatical category, that the words belong to. Like prepositions went first, right? Verbs sort of seem to go second. They have, they rely with Broca's aphasia pretty extensively on nouns. So they have what they call sort of a telegraphic speech, like, boy, university, good. I mean, like they can't say, my son goes to university, he's doing well. I mean, they don't do things like that. They can't have all those, grammatical terms and verbs, that help make the sentence much more, understandable and comprehensible, and you can express things better. So it turns out that the ventral temporal lobe, the temporal lobe we talked about being important for identifying what something was. Remember, the parietal lobe, when it comes to vision, helps you identify where something is, spatially in relationship to your body, right, in the environment, how things are related spatially. But what those things actually are is dependent upon, information, flow in regions of the temporal lobe. And naming seems to be quite, specifically associated with the left temporal lobe. And, there's lots of regions, like we were discussing, angula gyrus, the Wernicke's area. Part of that extended sort of comprehension network involves, areas in the ventral temporal lobe, the lower portion of the temporal lobe, that are specific for the naming and identification of, specific objects. So when you have somebody now in like an imaging, like a scanner, like an fMRI, and you're asking them to discriminate amongst different faces, for example, you'll see very selective regions of that temporal lobe, engaged by, object identification, by naming, who this person is versus that person versus that person. If you ask somebody to, discriminate, and name different animals, for example, you will actually see another region of the ventral temporal lobe, active in that form of, or that category of naming. Tools, another area. So there really is this kind of development of the temporal lobe regions in terms of how you, refer to things, in terms of language. Like, what do you call this? What do you call that? What do you call this? So visual identification, but also naming, particularly in the left temporal lobe. And damage to these regions can result in what we refer to as an anomia, a loss of the ability to name.